So we've already talked about what typically happens in terms of prenatal differentiation and sex development, which is usually that if XX chromosomes are present, then the offspring is female or a girl. And if during conception the chromosomes are XY, then of course that becomes male or a boy. But just like the other things we've talked about in terms of gender and identity being on a spectrum and sexual orientation being on a spectrum, it's probably no surprise to you that sex development also can happen with some variation to it. So that brings us to a conversation about atypical prenatal differentiation. So let me remind you what that term means. So atypical just means it's not what we usually see. Prenatal means that it's happening in utero. So we're talking about fetal development when the being is still a fetus inside the uterus of the maternal mother. And differentiation just meaning how we all develop differently. And because there is atypical prenatal differentiation, because that occurs, we have people who are born as intersex. And that's really the preferred term that's used today is intersex individuals. It's really an umbrella term for people who possess different biological attributes of both sexes, both male and female, or they may actually be born with ambiguous structures like genitalia that doesn't look like what we would typically expect for male or female. Now, this can happen on the chromosomal level, that somebody would have this atypical development. It can happen on the hormonal level, or in the way, again, that the reproductive or sexual structures look and act. So we're just going to talk about two different examples, but if you look in your text, you'll see there really is quite a bit of variation. So your textbook talks about different chromosomal combinations like XO or XXX that we're really not going to address as part of this lecture. But I will talk about two different types that are a little bit more common. One is androgen insensitivity syndrome, and the second one is Klinefelter syndrome. So let me go ahead and explain what those are. Androgen insensitivity syndrome refers to somebody who produces male hormones like testosterone, but they don't have the receptors to actually recognize that hormone is present. So all hormones function the same. You essentially need the hormone itself, which I'm going to represent with my fist here, and then you need a receptor for it. And so in terms of communication for the body to recognize that hormone, they have to come together. They have to fit together, like my fist and my open hand here. So you have hormones and receptors. What happens with androgen insensitivity syndrome is essentially you don't have these receptors, okay? But you could have lots of this male hormone swimming around in the body's bloodstream and system, but because the receptors are absent, the body doesn't recognize it. And so in not recognizing it, it's essentially as if that hormone weren't there. So this occurs in about 1 in 13,000 births, and these are people who may look very female in terms of how their body develops, and usually it's not until puberty that when they don't start menstruating that a doctor might do some more investigation, more testing, and find out, in fact, this person is XY. They may have undescended testes, so testes that are still up high in the body, so they weren't recognized at birth or in youth. And the person may look traditionally what we perceive as very female. In Klinefelter syndrome, that's not happening at a hormonal level, although it does affect hormones. It's happening at a chromosomal level. So you have an ovum that is XX instead of just a traditional straight X. And when a sperm fertilizes that XX ovum, you end up with a chromosomal makeup that is XXY. This is the most common type of intersex condition, and it happens, as you can see on the slide, in about 1 in 1,000 births. It can happen again on a spectrum. So for some, it may be they may have XXY chromosomes, but really not show many signs of it. For other people, it can be quite significant, and so the atypical development is very obvious. So let's take a look for Klinefelter syndrome, what that might look like. So typically for people who have Klinefelters, if they have outward signs of it, these hormones affect, the chromosomes, of course, affect hormones, and then hormones affect so many different parts of our development. So people with Klinefelters may be taller than average height. Typically, they may have reduced facial hair. They will have a penis and testes, but it might be smaller than we would see typically. They may have reduced body hair along with that reduced facial hair. May have some breast development at puberty. This is interesting. They may have some medical conditions that are associated with this. So osteoporosis refers to a condition where somebody has bones that aren't as strong. So it can be quite dangerous, actually, especially later in life. That's more typical with Klinefelters. Also, it's not on the slide, but learning disabilities are another characteristic that is more typical with people who have Klinefelters. They also may have what's referred to as a feminine fat distribution. And essentially what that means is that more of that pear-shaped body type with larger hips, more fat in the butt region would be referred to as a feminine fat distribution. And this is always interesting for me to teach about because I actually had a really good friend in college who had Klinefelter syndrome. And many of these characteristics were true for him. But his story is a rather typical one, which is that he didn't find out that he had Klinefelters until he was actually in college when I knew him. He was about 20 years old. And his parents they did know, and they finally sat him down and let him know. And quite honestly, it was a real identity crisis for him. He had a lot of mental health issues associated with that, including depression. He really echoes what I hear so strongly from the intersex community, which is that he wished he had been told earlier. There were a lot of things that in ways that he felt different once he went through puberty, that he said it would have been really helpful to know that there was actually a biological cause. So this is just the story you hear over and over again when you do research about this, that many people who are intersex were not told that they had these, this biological difference. And over and over again, you hear that people really wish that they had known. So the movement and a lot of the activism these days from the intersex community is really around education and advocacy for letting people know. In some cases, doctors didn't even let parents know that their children had these differences. And so we're really trying to move away from that in the medical community because we now know that psychologically it just causes a lot of harm. If you want to know more about intersex conditions beyond what's in your textbook, this is a wonderful resource, the Intersex Society of North America. So I suggest you search that and continue to educate yourself. Thank you.